Diane, we are absolutely honoured to have you as one of the ambassadors, the brand ambassadors of the Governance Institute of Australia. I was wondering if I might leave it to you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you so much, Megan, and I am delighted to be a brand ambassador for the Governance Institute of Australia. So I am a Perth-based independent non-executive director. I've been here on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and let me pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I've been here for just over a decade now. Before that, I spent almost 25 years out of Perth, over east, as we like to say, here in Western Australia. But I lived and worked in Asia, in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and then in the United States. So my portfolio is quite diverse, and I have designed it that way. I'm a board member of a couple of large listed Australian companies, but I also chair a government body, sit on the board of a state government agency, have pretty substantive pro bono activity around education and economics, and am a board member of a mutual organisation. So quite a lot of diversity there. I played a lot of sport in my younger days, and so I have done things in sport as well with Basketball Australia, because basketball was my sport. And now I'm a little involved tangentially with the anti-doping movement.
Wonderful. So let's turn our attention to managing during a pandemic. Of course, the topic on everyone's lips at the moment. It's been a highly unusual year for us all. Reflecting on the organisations that you are on the board of, what is the most significant step that those organisations took in a general sense to try and manage the impact of COVID-19?
Well, the first thing you have to do is make sure that everyone is doing their piece of the puzzle. And as a director, you have to think about the governance piece. So very quickly, there was a lot of relief coming out from ASIC and other regulators. And so taking a step back and thinking about, well, what is the regulatory construct in which I'm working and what are the new rules of the game? So informing yourself on safe harbour, what that actually looked like. And of course, there have been changes in the Australian system of recent times, and it really hadn't been pressure tested. So I actually have stuck up on the wall of my study a 2-page summary of the safe harbour and other considerations that a director would need to think about during the pandemic. And it was brought into stark relief for me because one of the companies I'm a director of is a private entity, but it operates in the aviation space. So you can imagine what happened with that particular company. And so we very quickly had to take a step back, look at our governance, think about the safe harbour plan, work out how we were going to replan the business. That came at a moment when we had just launched a refinancing. So in December 2019, we had started to take early steps towards a refinancing. So there we were in a very, very different world. And what we actually did was we determined as a board that we were going to stand down our committee structure. So we put the board charter, if you will, almost on pause, rewrote elements of it, and created a new committee structure populated with directors who had the appropriate skills. So one committee was worrying about immediate response and how we were handling the crisis, safety matters like that. And the other group was thinking about the refinancing and how we would pitch that in a way that would step us towards recovery. And so we operated in that mode for about 6 months. So just recently, we've gone back to the structure that we had before. But every time we met, and of course we were meeting at least on a weekly basis and often with the committees more frequently, we were taking that bit of a pause at the beginning of each meeting to just pressure test that the decisions we had made around our governance structure were appropriate. It was interesting to see the reactions of our lawyers, external auditors, assurance providers and so forth, who when we stepped them through this approach went, you know, that makes a huge amount of sense. Do you mind if I steal this with pride for a couple of my other clients?
Fantastic. So I want to talk to the human element next, because as we know, the pandemic is a human disaster first and foremost. It's a health crisis that has, of course, transcended into an economic crisis. But and of course, it's a physical health crisis, but also there's a mental health crisis that's ballooning thereafter. So I wanted to ask you, what is some of the most effective steps that you've taken to keep your team and workforce engaged and safe during the crisis, and particularly the upheaval?
It is a very interesting time to be thinking about how those dynamics of interpersonal relationships and safety work all the way through the organisation. I think one of the toughest things for some non-executive directors has been to recognise that while they have huge experience in crisis response and they are at the top of the governance and hindsighting of the organisation, that it's not the time to stick your fingers in, just keep those fingers out and the nose in, and sit on your hands to a degree. And how difficult is it to feel almost like you're doing nothing when there is crisis response going on around you, but you have to stay in your role. So certainly, I know that a number of non-executive directors, myself included, have been asked to provide messages of support to staff, to do seminars in the online world of Zoom. I actually did one where I revealed how I do TV interviews in my living room with my computer on a ladder that I bought from Bunnings. It's a gorilla ladder. So, you know, a gorilla is a girl's best friend was the message that I sent out. So it's been interesting to get involved in those sorts of activities, but in general, you've got to take that one step back and make sure that you're helping the CEO to do everything they can to keep their executive team in the best leadership space. You do have to check in. Are you okay is an even more valid question at the moment, and particularly for people who've been in geographies where there has to be quite a substantive lockdown. I've been really pleased with AGL, one of my ASX listed directorships, that there were a lot of plans well progressed to start providing more guidance to people leaders about mental health in the workplace. Because of course people have a lot of questions. It's so prominent at the moment, but it was becoming more prominent, and people are asking very validly, am I supposed to be a psychiatrist at work? How do I make sure that I don't do things that actually make the situation worse? What about the privacy consideration? So all of these things wrapped in. But what AGL decided to do was that, well, this was a project in flight. We would keep this project going. And so Jo Fox and her HR team pushed that through with a great deal of support from Brett Redmond, who every week has been doing a video from home, just a short thing, and now in the office. And that direct communication that he has sent out to staff has been amazing. So already AGL was moving in these directions, and now the mental health training online has been launched, and it's quite a substantive program. And I thought, well, I'll just have a little pop into that, a dip in and see how it is. And now I'm finding that I actually now want to complete the whole thing. So I spent an hour last night going through and re-listening to the stress modules to just remind myself about how stress plays out, what are the things that you can do to address it. So I'm delighted that there are a lot more resources available to people leaders, because it is so important in this time. And there's some great books that are written on the subject as well from people leaders, and I think that's an important thing for directors to make sure that enough support is going through the organisation.
Yeah, and I think it's just such a great thing that the conversation is being had more openly from the boardroom through to the staff room. I think that's a real, if you can say, a benefit of the human side of this crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
So I asked this question of someone else a couple of weeks ago, and they told me it was binge watching Netflix. But on the serious side of things, what has been the main thing that's kept you up at night during COVID-19?
Well, I think it is that question about safety. It's the uncertainty. And I think that keeps all of us awake and worries us to a degree. You know, when you read about stress, uncertainty is a main contributing factor. And how do you have the grace under pressure, the resilience to be able to cope with the ambiguity. And just think it's really only been since the first week in March when this conversation started to happen around Australia. There were a number of corporates that were earlier to the table, but really getting the conversation out into the mainstream. I think it was that week of the 9th of March when it really started to come into stark relief. And there have been all sorts of debates since then about, how bad is this disease? What is the short-term versus the long-term implications of contracting it? If you get it, are you immune later? Can you get it a second time? Can you pass it on? How do you know when the shedding period is that provides, infection rates? What's the most common method of transmission? Are surfaces really important? Is it really all about hand sanitizers and disinfecting surfaces, or is it really about aerosols? And all of these questions, and so many of them still to be answered, and new information coming all the time, which is unsurprising given that we're only a few months down the track of this pandemic. Will we ever get a vaccine? And of course, that's the big one. So I think that's the thing that keeps me awake, is that uncertainty, and knowing that I'm needing to help management teams make decisions in a period of great uncertainty. Now, I've always felt that the definition of judgment is being able to make very good decisions without full information. And the further you go up an organisation, the decisions become bigger ticket items. They're more important. There's more risk involved in getting it wrong. And at the same time, the amount of truly certain information you've got decreases. So isn't that an interesting inverse proportionality? So I've always felt the reason that executives get paid so much is because they do have to make these very big ticket decisions in the absence of full information. And so think about the decisions we're making now to keep people safe, to try to make our businesses sustainable for the future, to keep our customers safe, to have something to restart out the other side with so little information. That's the thing I think that's keeping everybody awake at night.
That is such a great insight. It certainly resonates with my experience. Even as you go up in the executive world, you're supposed to be across so many different things that the depth of information you have on each individual matter decreases the more breadth you have to have in an organisation, and yet the buck stops with you for all decisions. So it's certainly very true I think in all organisations, and the board level then just takes it one step further.
Yeah, I had a bit of a light bulb moment the other day. There's been a lot of chat about millennials and are they resilient enough, and does a millennial need a hug, and I had sort of thought, this is interesting. I'm not sure how to think about that. I don't have children of my own, but I have two nephews and a niece that I'm very close to, and they fall into that millennial bracket. And I find them quite resilient, and, they like a hug, but they don't need a hug. And when I was reading a book that Genevieve Hawkins has written, Mentally at Work, which is about mental health, she makes a very valid point that the amount of information we would be making available to, let alone our leaders, but also our team members, they get about as much information in a week as when I was starting out, I used to get in about a year. So it's hardly surprising that we're actually finding it very difficult to process all that information, and that we're feeling, stressed as a result of it. So I think there's something in that observation of Genevieve's that is striking to what's going on with these millennials, and also provides some insight for executives about decision-making and how to think differently about it in the future. And of course, the board has to make sure that the decision-making framework of the organisation is robust. So the board needs to understand these dynamics really well.
Gosh, we could have another hour conversation about this matter, I think, but I want to move next on to your thoughts around the pathway out of the pandemic. Obviously, we're seeing the easing of restrictions differing from state to state, but gradually over time, obviously we're seeing an easing of restrictions and a return out from the depths of the lockdowns. What is on your radar across all your organisations with regards to the pathway out? What are the next steps?
It's a very interesting thing because generally, I think your position, your fitness to be able to do something is not determined completely by what you do from here on, but there's a lot of what you did before. And I think we're seeing that trends that were already evident in businesses that were under stress, perhaps finding growth hard, those trends have been accelerated and they've been deepened by the effects of the pandemic. And so I think some very unpleasant decisions are going to have to be made by organisations to reflect and understand that. But really, I think that what we've been trying to do across the Australian economy, which is to provide cash flow relief to businesses, be that from the government, providing waivers on payroll taxes, for example, providing JobKeeper subsidies, be it private enterprise like the banks providing an element of relief on payments. This notion of we try to push those cash flow payments later so that businesses can continue to operate and continue to keep the relationship with their people. And then we're hoping that what that means is that we're preserving value for the future, that the economy will be able to restart in this way. And so that's the test I've always been trying to apply. And I stole this with great pride from Paul Ryan, who leads JP Morgan's Infrastructure Investment Fund, IIF, who has said, we need to think about this lens. It's always cash flow, deferral of payments, preservation of value through that technique. And I think it's important that we try to be conceptual as directors and then see if management can come up with the granular ideas about then how to lead their businesses out of the pandemic. But you've seen businesses pivot really well. I'm really proud of the work that's been done at Bunnings to provide contactless click and collect and to really push forward on their online service delivery models a whole lot faster. I remember reading about a company that had been in stage production. So they make the stages for touring productions and so forth. Apparently it's quite a vibrant, big business. I didn't realise there was so much of it went on and that the stages were customised. But when you think about it, okay, that makes sense. Well, there went their business. What did they pivot to? Furniture for home-based working.
That's right.
Because they're good at making relatively swiftly, relatively cheaply, but robust bits of unusual sort of furniture. So they were thinking about, well, okay, how do we make the right size but teeny tiny study desks so that every kid can have one in their bedroom and so forth. And so that pivoting, that creativity, I think is one of the things that will drive us out of the pandemic.
Yes, and I think you're right. I think that supply chains and customers and the general community, they're going to really remember not just how we performed during the pandemic, but they're going to remember how we behaved during the pandemic in terms of supporting our supply chains, supporting our customers. I think that's very true. I wanted to talk a little bit about your role as chair of boards. Inside the boardroom, obviously, a lot has changed and needed to change to effectively facilitate virtual board meetings. So we're all in a Zoom world. You and I were talking before about all the Zoom tips that you get. But really digging a little bit more deeply, how do you enable multiple perspectives to make sure that they're heard in a virtual format? How do you invite contributions? How do you assist others to lead the participation and facilitated participation? How do you make sure that the appropriate time is spent on each agenda item and all of those things? If you can give us some insights into how you chair a board meeting.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really liked about the way people have, in my community, in the non-executive director community, have responded to the pandemic is there is a huge amount of sharing. If someone finds something good, they're shooting it around really quickly to people they think will find it helpful. So there's none of this, oh, well, isn't this a clever idea? I'll hold this to myself. So when someone's found a good article, around it comes. And David Thodey sent a beauty from Harvard Business Review, which I'm sure a lot of people will have seen, about how to think about chairing a Zoom meeting well. So it's a really good article. And interestingly, a lot of the things that were in there, I could see in the behaviour of myself as a chair or some of the other chairs that I've been working with. I think the most important thing is we need to recognise that you just can't concentrate out 8 hours a day on a Zoom meeting. You know, it is a very different sort of technique, and anything that's new needs to be approached, you know, with a bit of respect, and learn different ways to do it. So the careful curation of breaks has been important. I think that a lot of chairs actually struggle with this in the real world as well. When's the moment to take the natural break? And so I think making sure that you've got time for directors to actually be able to have the natural break, eat something, make sure their water glass is filled, that type of thing. And you're working across different time zones. So you might have a director in the US, in New Zealand, in Sydney, in Perth. And okay, so how do we make sure everybody eats? Because when you all come together, you have lunch at the same time. And it's a small thing, you know, but if people don't have, you know, well hydrated and their blood sugar is not at the right level, it can have unpleasant consequences in the boardroom. Graham Hunt at AGL has got a practice where he asks us to provide questions on notice for the executive team. And I've really valued that as a practice. It really does actually help remove the potential for the sort of gotcha questions that sometimes get asked in boardrooms. My observation on those gotcha questions is often they're not meant to be gotchas, but you're trying to communicate crisply and you're trying to give a bit of context as to why I'm asking this question. And so that really means that you can often just not quite get the question out as elegantly as you would like. But when you sit down and write the question on notice, it makes it a whole lot easier. So that's a practice I'm really celebrating. The other thing that I really rather like is that it's by chunking the board meeting up and creating big breaks, you think about, well, when will we have the private session? Because the private sessions are not pleasant for the executive team. They're outside the room. The private session's been allocated 15 or 20 minutes. Maybe it takes 40. So the executives are all going, what are they talking about? You know, what's wrong? What have we done? Who is it? So by the time they then walk in to give their updates, they're all on edge. So by cutting the private session away from the board meeting and starting the board meeting right on time, I've noticed a real improvement in the demeanour of some executives in the boardroom. Because often in that private session, you know, you haven't seen your colleagues for 3 or 4 weeks, and now you're in the room, and so there's a bit of chatter that goes on. There's always 15 minutes of ice breaking, you know, as you catch up on what's happened to this person's kids that are going in year 12 and, you know, so on and so forth. So now we've moved all of that to a different place. One group I know has done some really interesting team building where they've had meal delivered for the private session. So they have the board dinner. Everyone gets the same meal and the bottle of wine, you know, that comes with it, which is sort of a cute idea, but difficult for me in Perth, having to expect to eat my dinner at 5 p.m, which is not my normal practice. And I'm dying to hear about one of the executive teams who's going to do a virtual cooking class at the weekend for team building in the executive team, but they're getting a chef beaming in from Italy. How exciting is that? And so they've had all of the produce and the menu and so forth all delivered, and they're all going to cook the same meal under this guy's tutelage by Zoom. I think it's fascinating. So there's so many things that are happening like that. What I would say is do be very careful if you're in a situation where you have one group of directors, perhaps they're in a geography where they are allowed to meet, but you've got some people that are in other geographies can't travel. All directors need to always be created equal. And so we've made a conscious decision in some places that while we might let one locally based director go in with the executive team, everybody else will be on Zoom. Because otherwise you sort of create a room that looks in on itself, and the people on Zoom can get, to a degree, left out. It's a bit of a riff, you know, the days when someone would be telco and you'd forget all about them. So the thing is, everyone needs a different response, but it needs to be a thoughtful response. It needs to be done explicitly. And I think it's a really good idea to stop every couple of meetings and go, how are we doing?
Indeed. They're just such great practical suggestions. I love the Zoom fatigue. I think if there's going to be a couple of phrases that enter the lexicon in 2020 into the Urban Dictionary, it's going to be Zoom fatigue and the phrase "you're on mute." It's going to be the two that are going to make it to the dictionary. And that's great advice. I must say that even in our executive team at the Governance Institute, we have a distributed leadership team, and we have found that conducting our meetings via Zoom, so that irrespective of whether the staff are in any state in Australia, they're all equal participants in the meeting, has actually made for a much better culture in our executive team. So that's really interesting as well, really interesting observation.
It's interesting though, Megan, just to, you know, thinking about one thing, like I can see you as clearly as anything because I know you've got the right lighting in the room, and I hope you can see me too. You know, I've got a ring light in front of me so that, you know, you can see the nuance of my expression. You can see the things that make my eyes sparkle and things that make me go, oh. And I'm finding it difficult when some of my colleagues are in shadow the whole time, because they haven't thought about that. And it's a funny thing because you almost feel like you're being a bit princessy to say, why don't you get a proper light? Or, you know, I can't see you well enough. It is funny how some of these things are a bit hard for us to step through. So I'm making a mental note. I'm going to actually send a text to all of those directors that I can't see their faces and say, I can't see your face. It's making it harder for me to connect with you on Zoom. So that's my takeout for today.
Yeah, and I think it's just a new world of new etiquettes in a new environment, in the same way at a physical meeting that you would do things like turn up on time and be appropriately dressed and all of, it's just new etiquettes for a new environment, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good observation though. And with regards to sharing of resources, I must say we got a fabulous resource via some information that came out from the telehealth sector and the psychology sector of the telehealth sector, talking about how they engage on Zoom with their patients, and, you know, some fabulous tips once again. So, and that you can translate to a business environment. So, you know, just great tip sharing, I think, is going on, and that's a fabulous thing. Moving to outside of the boardroom, has there been a noticeable change or an expansion in the role? For example, what impact has the crisis had on the usual responsibilities like communicating with shareholders, meeting with the CEO regularly, providing updates for board members in between meetings? What sort of things are you seeing that happen outside the actual boardroom?
Yeah, so it's a really good question that you're raising, because it's very clear that frequency of contact has changed across all sorts of different needs, and also a desire to go one or two levels deeper into detail. You know, and in my consulting world, I worked on large transformation projects, and whenever anything went a little bit off track, that was always the response. Shorten the cycle time of inquiry, go one layer deeper. And it's exactly the same if you've got someone whose performance is slipping. You go and check in with them more frequently. You say, look, we've been having a fortnightly one-on-one, let's make it weekly. You ask them to bring you a bit more detail. So it's a tried and true way of responding to difficult times. And so it would be crazy to expect that the boards wouldn't be doing exactly that same thing. So I described earlier when I was talking about the private company that I'm on, how we had looked at the committee structures and we had decided that we were going to stand down those committee structures and stand up different committees. And those committees were meeting on a weekly cycle, very different to the 4 times a year of the other committees. And they were looking at much richer data. Now, is that stepping outside the role? I don't think it is stepping outside the role of a director. It's not starting to manage the company. It is that same hindsight role, guiding role, directing role in protection of the sustainable long-term future of the company, which of course is the thing directors are responsible for. And so as long as you are making it a conscious decision that you're going to look more frequently and you're going to perhaps, even remove some of the delegations and reserve some more rights up to the board, as long as you do it in a way that is explicit, it's clear, that it's not just some offhand informal agreement. It's hard to think that during times like this, you have to go and grab out your delegation's authority and formally change it. But you actually do need to do that if you're going to make sure that everyone has got the certainty of their authority to act and you understand why you're doing these things. So I wouldn't say that scope has changed or activities have changed. It's more about the depth of information you require to complete your usual tasks, and it's the frequency with which you do them.
Well, Diane, thank you so much for your insights on managing through the pandemic. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks very much, Megan. Always a pleasure.